Let me tell you a story of a friend of mine, Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee was born and raised in Singapore. He was the youngest of 5 children. His parents were immigrants from China, and they worked hard to provide for their family. Mr. Lee's father was a construction worker, and his mother was a seamstress. Mr. Lee was a bright and ambitious child. He excelled in school, and he dreamed of one day becoming a successful businessman. However, his life took an unexpected turn when he was 16 years old. His parents both passed away in a tragic accident. Mr. Lee was devastated by the death of his parents. He felt lost and alone. His older siblings had already moved out and started their own families. Mr. Lee was left to fend for himself. Mr. Lee dropped out of school and got a job as a waiter. He worked long hours and saved every penny he could. He wanted to build a better life for himself. When Mr. Lee was 21 years old, he started his own business. He opened a small grocery store. Mr. Lee worked hard and his business was successful. He was able to buy a house and a car. He also got married and had 2 children. Mr. Lee was living the dream. He had a successful business, a loving family, and everything he could ever want. However, his happiness was short-lived. When Mr. Lee's children were in their teens, they started to rebel. They didn't want to listen to him or follow his rules. They spent all their time with their friends and ignored their studies. Mr. Lee tried everything he could to help his children. He talked to them, he punished them, and he even sent them to therapy. But nothing worked. His children were determined to live their own lives. One day, when Mr. Lee's children were in their early 20s, they both left home without saying goodbye. They never contacted Mr. Lee again. Mr. Lee was heartbroken. He didn't understand why his children had abandoned him. He had loved them and cared for them their whole lives. Mr. Lee felt lost and alone. He didn't have any other family or friends. He threw himself into his work, but it wasn't enough. He was still hurting from the loss of his children. Mr. Lee worked hard all his life to save for retirement. However, the cost of living in Singapore is very high. No matter how hard Mr. Lee tried, he couldn't save enough money to retire comfortably in Singapore. He knew that he would have to continue working until he died. Mr. Lee was devastated. He had worked so hard his whole life, and now he was going to have to keep working until the very end. He felt like he had failed. One day, Mr. Lee was talking to a friend about his retirement plans. His friend told him about the low cost of living in Malaysia. He suggested that Mr. Lee consider retiring in Malaysia. Mr. Lee did some research and realized that his friend was right. The cost of living in Malaysia was much lower than in Singapore. He could retire comfortably in Malaysia on the same amount of money that he was currently spending on living expenses in Singapore. Mr. Lee made the decision to retire in Malaysia. He sold his house and business in Singapore and moved to Johor Bahru, Malaysia. He bought a small house in a retirement village and quickly settled into his new life. Mr. Lee was finally able to relax and enjoy his retirement. He made new friends and started enjoying the Malaysian culture. He also started to heal from the pain of his children's abandonment. One day, Mr. Lee was walking through the park when he saw a group of children playing. He stopped to watch them, and he was filled with a sense of joy. He realized that he could finally let go of the past and focus on the present. Mr. Lee was grateful for his new life in Malaysia. He had found peace and happiness. He was finally able to live the life that he had always wanted. Mr. Lee lived a long and happy life in Malaysia. He was a beloved member of the retirement village community. He was always willing to help others and share his wisdom. Mr. Lee passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 90. He was surrounded by his friends and loved ones. Mr. Lee's legacy will live on in the hearts of the people who knew him. He was a kind and generous man. Hope you liked the story. Take care, and I see you in my next video.